Start.
She's Zoom meeting असते.
I think Ramesh and Rochelle can unmute themselves and let's have a video. And once I've said my piece, I will. Yeah.
Good evening, everyone.
Yeah.
We're going to have this program, Bombay Hangovers. So I request everyone to mute yourself and stop your video for better connectivity.
Yeah.
Enjoy the program. Thank you.
So hello all. I'm Meenal Shirsagar, chairperson of the Literary Club of the Asiatic Society of Mumbai. And I'm delighted to welcome you here this evening for a session that promises to be very stimulating. A conversation between two young literary people, the author of Bombay Hangovers, Rochelle Potkar, and our member, Ramesh Gauri Raghavan, who has been a friend over many long years. Together, they will take us into a variety of spaces here in our city of Mumbai, sharing with us new perspectives on the lives of people around us. Rochelle has penned multiple short stories in her book, Bombay Hangovers, that evoke the human experience. And it's with a lot of compassion and deep insights. And I'm sure that once you are, by the end of this evening, you will be inspired to read her stories, get hold of her book. The link can be put onto the chat box. And I'm sure everyone will enjoy it as much as I have. I've not read all the stories, but I've read most of them. And they're really, really very interesting, very enjoyable to read. So allow me to first give you a very brief introduction to our speakers before I hand over the virtual floor to them. So I will present Rochelle to you in her own words. To start with, I quote, "Fictionist, poet, critic, curator, editor, translator, screenwriter, Rochelle Potkar beats to a Goan heart in industrious Mumbai." So that's a lovely way of putting it, Rochelle. She is an alumna of Iowa's International Writing Program and a Charles Wallace Fellow, University of Stirling. She's the author of 4 Degrees of Separation. Her book of Haibun, Paper Asylum, was shortlisted for the Rabindranath Tagore Literary Prize 2020. Her poetry film, Skirt, showcased on Shonda Rhimes' Shondaland. Her poems, To the Raza, won the 2018 Norton Giraud Literary Prize UK, and The Girl from Lal Bazaar was shortlisted at the Gregory O'Donoghue International Poetry Prize, Ireland in 2018. Widely anthologized, she has read her poetry in several countries. I won't name all of them, it's too long a list. Her writings have been translated into Arabic, Hungarian, French, Spanish, Marathi, Bengali, and German. Wow. So we have a fascinating and talented young person with us today. Thank you, Rochelle, for accepting our invitation.
Thank you. Thank you, ma'am.
And in keeping with the trend of self-description, I will start by giving Ramesh his turn. I quote, "Ramesh Gauri Raghavan moonlights as an award-winning copywriter by day and daylights as an award-wanting poet by night, and sandwiches writing haiku, haibun, and tanka, editing the literary e-journal Narrow Road, deciphering the occasional inscription, peer counseling for suicide prevention, and learning languages in between. He thinks he is funny, but his friends vehemently disagree." End of quotation. So on a more serious note, I will add, and I'd like you to hold your breath here. I will tell you what he's all about and what he has achieved in his young life. So he's a marketeer by profession, scientist by training, epigraphist by choice, and poet by night. So Mr. Ramesh Gauri Raghavan has a BSc, MS and certificate in archaeology. He is creative head at White Digital Canvas and literary editor of the literary journal Narrow Road, as I said. Also a member of the editorial board of Cafe Haiku. His literary publications include poems, short stories, haiku and haibun in several magazines and anthologies, while his academic publications span the ethno-archaeology of the Bene Israel, ancient board games, the archaeology of ballistic weapons and fortifications, and bullock carts. He has taught epigraphy at the University of Mumbai, at Sathe College, Wilson College, Institution Trust, Mumbai Research Center of the Asiatic Society of Mumbai, and Speaking Archaeology. He has organized Distilled Images, a national conference on Haikai literature in India in 2014 with SIES College, and with the Institution Trust in 2019, the first national conference on ancient and medieval Indian games, Playing with the Past, sponsored by the Indian Council of Historical Research. He has also helped organize the Explorations in Maharashtra workshops and archaeology of Maharashtra conferences from 2015 to 2019, including the publishing of the proceedings. So we have with us a truly amazing personality this evening, and I'm happy and proud to say that he is on our team at the Asiatic Society. Thank you, Ramesh, for being with us and also for the work you do at the Asiatic. And now I am sure everyone is waiting eagerly to listen to this duo in conversation. So I hand over the proceedings to you.
Thank you very much, ma'am. I think I should have kept my bio short than that. But let's get down to the floor, Rochelle. And I'm going to start on a very personal note. So as Meenal ma'am has said, I edit the journal Narrow Road, which has 3 sections: poetry, short fiction, and haibun. I edit the poetry section. I have co-editors for short fiction and haibun. But if I handed it over to Rochelle, she could edit all 3 without an eye blink. So my first question to you, Rochelle, is what keeps you from specializing in any one form? I mean, wouldn't it be easier if you just told the visiting card printer that your designation was either poet or writer or hygiene?
Thank you, Ramesh, for this question. First and foremost, I would like to thank the Asiatic Society of Mumbai for having me over and the Literary Club. And good evening to all of you here. I'm so glad that I'm here and I'm spending time. We are all spending this time together. And thank you, Meenal ma'am. Thank you, Dr. Usha. Thank you, Vispi ma'am and Ramesh and all my friends here. Okay, so Ramesh, to hell with the printer. But okay, let's be empathetic towards the printer. No, I think I have the tendency or the restlessness of a flitting butterfly or a bee to want to be on as many forms and kind of extract nectar. So I have just given into my restlessness and allowed myself to be a poet, or then a haibunier, or then a short story writer, and now I'm currently also digging into long forms of novels and screenplays. So I think it has somewhere to do with that restlessness. So I will deal with the printer later.
As a writer, you cannot diss the printer that easily, nevertheless.
No, but we are only talking about the printer of business cards, right? So I'm not going to have a business card.
Okay, so question 1B is, well, we're all familiar with poetry and short fiction. We've done plenty of that in school. Most of it we probably hated, especially the poetry. The short fiction, those interested in English probably read all the short stories before the school year started, right? But when it comes to haibun, I don't think we've ever heard of it. You and me probably started haibun even later than we started anything else. So what got you into Haibun, and what is that Haibun does do to your poetry and your fiction? Or is it your poetry and your fiction that informs your Haibun?
Hmm. You know, this has to be a pet question, especially when we are Haibun practitioners. Okay. I don't know how many of us practice Haibun in this group, that is this evening, but we are always ready to convert people. Okay. I think we suffer from that the moment you get addicted to this form. So, in fact, I conduct workshops wherever I can. Okay. In fact, I even put this form on the syllabus of St. Xavier's College when I was an industry expert on, yeah. So I pushed it inside. So I think the Haibun form for me is all embracing because it allows me to be the storyteller and the poet. And no other form gave me that much amount of acceptance and flexibility that, like, if you look at a flash fiction, it needs you to complete itself in act 3. So you have a beginning, middle and end, and you need some kind of end. You look at a short story, you need so many details. You look at a novel, you need a lot of research, and so on and so forth. Even a poem has, when you look at a poem, it has to be rhythmic, but it needs to have brevity. Haibun was the only elastic form, that said, okay, be the storyteller when you want, talk in abstract when you want, be concrete when you want, okay, and be the poet when you want. You don't need to complete the the tale or the narrative. You could just end it with some haiku, and you could vanish around the bend, and no one is going to catch you and say, where's the end, where's the beginning, where's the middle. So it allowed me to just do it. And I think I came to Haibun when I failed writing haiku. So, like, we can go on and on talking of what a haiku is, but it is basically a juxtaposition of images. And it's not about the syllable count that we sometimes pressure ourselves with. I think a lot of people don't write haiku because they keep thinking, oh my God, I'm not going to get the syllable count right. And I need to count the syllables. And we are stuck at some other level wherein what we need to do is to juxtapose two images from nature and human existence. So I think I had failed in my first haiku. I just wrote 3 lines, and the haiku brought me to the Haibun. And the Haibun told me, you can be storyteller, you can be poet, and you could just write abstract or concrete. You could base it with the motifs of people, place, phenomena, or you could just talk of something dreamlike. It's fine. And so I think I have not wasted any idea. We always scribble some little ideas here and there, on our phones or in some Excel spreadsheet. I've not wasted any idea where it came to Haibun. Anything could be used.
I have a whole lot of stillborn poems and short stories lying here in it.
In fact, I caught you writing Haibun in one of the most boring festivals in Guntur. You wrote 3 Haibun, okay? And I was like, he knows what he's doing. In the most boring places, you would be scribbling your Haibun. And so I think that's what it kind of frees you. And I think,
Thoroughly.
yeah, we are chroniclers somewhere of our times, or trying to make sense. And when Haibun allows you to make that sense in one page, so it's better than a novel in that sense. Yeah. And you're talking about the intersection of fiction and poetry. I think that converges to this form for me.
Thank you. When it comes to the kind of stories you write, so you have written stories of a Parsi perfumer. You're neither Parsi nor a parfumier. You wrote stories of your first story is of a mathematical couple who are dealing with breast cancer. I know you're not a mathematician, and I hope the second part isn't true either. You wrote stories of an assistant manager in a textile mill. You wrote stories of being the mother of a mentally challenged child who's aging. And then you decided all the way to write the story of a Himachali servant in Shimla before the mutiny. So clearly, it goes without saying that you are driven by a very, very fecund imagination. But nowadays it seems there's a new school, and I kind of belong to your school. I may not have the same imagination as you, but I still think of weird people to write stories into. In fact, I meet people and I'm like, okay, where can I fit this person as a character into a story?
Mhm.
So everybody who walks across the street from me is a potential character. And I'm sure
Okay.
it's for you too.
Yes, absolutely.
But no, today, nowadays, for example, a little earlier this year, we had this a rather bitter fight where a white Dutch woman was not allowed to translate Amanda Gorman's poem because she was not black or American. She couldn't be if she had to translate it into Dutch, but nevertheless, you know. Or when a Scottish writer created a traditionally built #1 lady detective in Botswana, there is a group who's cringed because he's Scottish and white, not black and Botswanan. There's this entire school today that requires you as the writer to have experienced the story or the poem you're writing, and only then can it be authentic. I wonder if the kind of school where you had writers like Dickens and Bond and Kipling, Doyle, Saki, O. Henry, all our school textbook favorites. There was a time when they would tramp around in pubs and docks and streets, and they'd literally pump people for material, buy them rounds of beer, get them drunk, tell them their stories. I mean, some of the most immortal short stories in English come from such people.
Mhm.
I know it's a sort of continuum, it's not a binary. Everybody who experiences something is not necessarily the best person to write it. And nor can I say that everybody who researches a story is necessarily the best, has managed to bring out the circumstance correctly. So, what do you think of this? You can only write if you're experienced it kind of school of thinking. Which side of the continuum do you think you're on?
Mhm. Mhm. Very interesting. Very interesting that you raise so many questions in one question. Um, yeah, I think I belong to this somewhere in the center. Because I feel imagination is as authentic. Querying and soul seeking is as authentic. Observing people, studying them and analyzing them is as authentic. And then empathy. There cannot be said anything less or more about empathy, because empathy is something that you need in this world as much as you can get and more, because we don't have enough of it. That's the reason, besides everything else, we go to art, to consume art, to understand a little more from the other side. Why do we otherwise partake in art? We should have been human enough to have all the empathy required to process existence, but we don't. So I think I come somewhere in the center, wherein for me the research, the imagination, the observation, and sometimes lived experiences, but sometimes just asking people, not getting them drunk, of course, just talking to them or listening to them. Listening also is so important, but also not listening to their words as much as what they are not saying, because a lot of people say things, but it is in their not saying, it is in their silent conduct of their lives, that you can see much more than what they say. I don't think we represent ourselves as people very well. Okay, we live. When we live, we act, we behave, and if you just watch people for long, you'll be able to connect those things, which in storytelling they sometimes call milestones. But I think, literature is not as entertaining or amusing as life, as you watch. And no matter how many people you come across and you want to characterize them, I think there are too many people, too many interesting people to finally get on the page. And sometimes you have this feeling, I don't know whether you have it, Ramesh, and all the others in this room, you feel that you're going to run out of breath and time, but never out of muses. And you might need another 2 3 lives, and you so want to wish ki, I wish I had one more life, and maybe one more life, and then I'll complete all this. There are so many interesting things going on. Having said that, so I do come from that idea that not everything can be a lived experience. How can it be? I think, when I look and examine my life, it's very ordinary. My life, it's just a simple life with some things eventful here and there, some challenges, some life lessons. It's not such a magical big canvas life. But what is interesting is life in front of me. That's very interesting. That's changing all the time. So I could not have that much amount of lived experience to write. So I would have to look around and mine it, for all the wonder that's there. Now talking about Amanda Gorman, I have some conflicting thoughts on both sides. In fact, I think that race or racial experience is unique. Okay, and maybe the Dutch woman would not really know enough. Maybe she would know enough. Sometimes, I felt that maybe they should have taken a sample of her writings or translations and then decided to oust her, so that we would know, because art, the end of art is empathy. And we could say that she didn't have racial experience, the Dutch woman, but we don't know whether she had enough of empathy. Maybe she had enough of empathy, and the end of literature is empathy. Once you have that, you reach the other side, and we are all trying to get to the other side. So we don't know. So on one hand, I think about that, but on the other hand, I also agree that when people who have been marginalized in the past get capital, they want to share it first with their breed, their group, their tribe. So it is very, I think it's also the matter of sharing capital. Like Amanda Gorman has come to the stage after so many years. So first it's the Black community, then it is the white. So somewhere I feel, okay, that also makes sense. But then segregation of another kind, okay, that doesn't make sense. So I'm somewhere also kind of caught up in this. I don't have a single vote,
Thank you. So all kinds of stories, something from the life of Kailash, something from the life of Joe Pereira. Please read us a few of their lives.
So I wonder, if I could read. So before I read, I'm thinking I'll take, if you want, I'll take Kailas, the textile person. But before that, I just want to bring it back to the title of this conversation, which was Sweating the Sensorium of the City. And I must tell you, when Meenal ma'am asked us, tell us a little bit more, and I was thinking about it. And we all will agree here, because I think a lot of us are Mumbaikars, that the city, it gets into you with all five of its senses. And if you go by the Japanese school of thought, memory is the sixth sense. So you kind of are infused into the city with all your senses. And so when you start writing, you're writing with all your senses. So I have found that in this book of mine, this little book of short stories, somehow there's one sense dominant in one short story or the other. So sometimes it's the sound of the city, which is in the story Noise, that I'm constantly trying to associate what is noise and silence to these characters, because the noise of a city that you live in, you love and hate in, okay, is also a heartbeat. It's another kind of heartbeat. Same is the case with smells. Same is the case with sights. I always thought Bombay was a very grey city. It was always overcast. There was always some grey buildings and some grey flyovers and grey concrete. It was so grey. And I'm searching for that little green, and that little orange, and that little laburnum yellow. So I think this is what has happened, which I've realized sooner or later, that there's one sense that dominates every story. So in Fabric, it's the noise of the mills and the change of the milieu from mill to mall. So I'll read, I think, the first page. Yeah, one page, I'll just read. Fabric, Baikala, Part 1. Kailas's father, Damu, worked in Karimboy textile mill, and even when very young, he knew his father's place of work meant a lot. Every holiday, Damu would sneak Kailas into the mill, and while his father chatted with the oilers and loom cleaners, Kailas played around the dye houses, engine houses, and workshops. He watched water flowing from the scribbling, carding, and spinning as his father slowly mouthed these words for him, with a glow over his face. Kailas never forgot the hum of boilers and the song of engines in the weaving shed, after he heard them first. He hoped his mother would work in the mills too, so she could leave him in the mill's creche with other children. On an idle Sunday, the family visited Mazgaon docks to watch raw cotton bales for the mill come in. No wonder by the time he was 16, Kailas hung around the mill just to chat with his father's friends, who had become his friends. He even befriended the supervisors and assistant spinning managers as he observed the production manager on the sly, admiring his gait and sense of dressing. Kailas was certain that one day he would be a production manager. The mill was family, its world like a life put to good use. At 18, when Kailas began working in the spinning department, it felt like homecoming. He let his senses gorge on the smells of bale, watching cotton strum from fiber to yarn, fabric to textile, strand upon slivering strand from clouds, teetering with fibrous dexterity into a rain of thread, planes of cloth. Spindles ran at 16,000 ribbon per minute. The clickety-clackety of the ginning and weaving machines and power looms echoed through, hitting the mill's high ceiling and wafting out of its high windows. This rhythm, interjected with sirens from shift changes and lunch and tea breaks, settling into Kailas's mind and daily impulse, like an echo of a heartbeat. Come back to work after every holiday, he felt like breathing, nestling snugly in the humid embrace of cotton dust, swimming in the air of good promises. Yeah, I think I'll stop here because then it moves to the next episode of how he goes on to wanting to be, complete his commerce graduation and become a production manager, which he eventually doesn't because his dream is interrupted with the textile mill shutting down. Yeah.
Let me interrupt you before you give your story away.
No, I won't. I'm stopping.
We live in a culture of spoiler alerts and
Yeah.
so anyway, I love, but one spoiler I will give away, which is the way you frame this particular story and the changing time. The story is also a little history of Bombay because it's set in the mills and those mills have long disappeared. We were children when the mills crumbled.
Right.
And yet you have captured, I don't know which mill workers you managed to get drunk and pump the information. But the way you framed it, and at least that's a framing I can understand.
Yeah.
You started with, say, the old brands we knew, Chirag Deen, for example, and many other brands you rattled out, and those which Kailas could just ogle at.
Right.
And then the wheels turned, and now we have brands like Peter England and Van Heusen and some other unpronounceable ones.
Yes.
And somewhere the entire city has changed between them.
Yes.
So I particularly love that framing device of yours.
Right. I'm glad you don't accuse it as listicles because I suffer from listicles because I think when you join the dots on even if you take history through shirts, post liberalization and then what opened up and then homegrown shirts and shopper stop shirts, and only if you look at shirts, I had to actually just put out a call to all my friends who lived in the 80s and 90s. Tell me the shirts you remember from those times also, so that I could get this entire listicle. And that in itself told me that there were so many shirts and what did shirts mean to men. Yeah.
Most fascinating. Then, of course, you draw a lot from your Goan, Catholic, Kalyan, out of Bombay, in Bombay experience. So there was one about an assistant creative director in Parel who came from one of the central suburbs.
Yes.
When I started reading, I thought you were writing about me. Because once upon a time, I was an assistant creative director in Parel from a central suburb.
Okay. Wow. That's seriously a tukka. But I wasn't. I was writing about a friend of a friend. Yeah. Who lived in Ambarnath. Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah. Huh.
So how did, there are these beautiful or unbeautiful tensions that dominate the city. Some of which you captured. there are religious tensions, the suburban versus Mumbai tension. I think there are even micro tensions between the people who live in Malabar Hill versus the people who live in Dadar Parsi colony.
Yes. Could be.
Then there's the eastern suburbs versus western suburbs. Kalyan East versus Kalyan West.
Always.
All of these little
Always the
tensions.
east and the west. Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Yeah. Tell me.
So how did you internalize these and how do you convert them into stories that capture a deeply insecure city? I think several of your stories are all about the many failures that we sort of live with. That
Right,
ultimately
right.
every life in Mumbai is not that success story that seems to be to outsiders. You know, we call it Maya Nagri, but Maya it is. It's an absolute mirage.
Yeah, yeah.
So which of these?
I think, yeah. No, yeah. I think it's because I came from the satellite town of Kalyan. So I was born and bred in Kalyan, and I moved to Bombay when I was 18. So by then I already was a small town juxtaposed with a city kind of person in my head. Okay, so my journey is everywhere, and a lot of my characters, not every character in this book, but a lot of my characters, they always have this ready-made journey कि वो small town से आए हैं city में. Okay, because I came from there, so I so liked that whole journey. But apart from that, I feel India itself was moving from village to town, town to city. It was also transmogrifying. So one of my poems, actually, Transmogrification, has that kind of understanding of how you funnel out, you know, from place and person. Both people move like river to sea. We are expanding and expanding. But when I came to the city, I think I had a lot of expectations being in living in the satellite town, and a lot of it was just built on dreams of independence, you know, which I will fulfill in Bombay. And I used to only go to the Bandra Fair and Crawford Market, okay, to buy gold. And it was a big affair, yeah, coming to Bombay, because I was still a school going girl. So for me, that these were excursions. And I lived in a Catholic colony wherein there were only two kinds of people who lived in my colony or in my building complexes. Either they were planning to go to Goa, yeah, and they were on that native place trip, or they were planning to go to Bandra Fair to Bombay. So it was either they're going to Bombay or they're going to Goa. So you had this kind of bubbling aspirant, you know, and all the aunties around and the uncles around and the children around were all about Bombay, Goa, and otherwise they were doing their studies. So I lived in this very simple world in Kalyan. Now Kalyan has also changed, of course. It is also transmogrified. It's no longer the Kalyan I lived in. So coming to the city, I could have this outsider's perspective because everything was new to me, and everything was blatantly like, what, you know, that kind of a thing for me. So whether it was something like you know, this entire complexity is because the town felt very simple then. You know, I think you could only get that very quickly as to what I meant is in my poem Knotted Inside Me, which actually tells you what I thought about the town to the city. But the city definitely surprised me. It shocked me. It stunned me. There was everything here. So I could only manage to capture a few things, but I really like dichotomy and irrationality in human beings. I think that is the irrationality is the most amusing, exciting, and perfect thing in a human being. You know, not only because it creates conflicts, but I think that is who we are as people. We are something on the front stage, something on the backstage, something we say, something we do. There is you know, a slip between the practice and the preaching. So I like that, and I think following that, I followed the city and found its cracks, plenty of them, but not in an unforgiving way. I don't judge the city, but I'm very amused by all these imperfections and cracks that are there. Some of them which have come into the stories, and this whole imperfection. Probably I'm curating imperfection all the time.
So let's have some more smells and sounds of this sensorium.
I'm wondering. Yeah, and also talking about you know, as you said, this ad guy who lives in Ambernath. I thought about the geographic racism that's there sometimes. I'm giving it a very big word. It's not such a big word, but it's definitely there. Like you would always hear this phrase which you never understood what it meant first. They would be like, oh, that's the back of beyond. And you're like, what? What's the back of beyond? Beyond is the back of beyond. Stars are the back of beyond. But it meant beyond Bandra, we can't see you. Or beyond Andheri, what is that? And Borivali, oh my God, a jungle. So it was like, hey, then what happens to Ambarnath? What happens to Badlapur? So I started thinking about how, because people had real life, not to joke, real life kind of microaggressions, wherein if they came from a faraway place, their real estate where they lived, the window view was so important to Bombay, So the window view is very important. And where is it located in Bombay? And I was like, wow, I never thought of this because I live so inside my head that my windows are my eyes and that's a real estate, my headspace. So does it really matter where I live? But it matters so much, this address, So I found that very funny, very fascinating, very hilarious, and also for the people who go through it very seriously, sad, because they said, they may not be able to speak the language. On top of that, they have these other things. They come from far away. And I was like, wow, this also exists. But then this exists in every city in the world. I've seen, this happen between the suburbs and the downtown. That's there. There is something about, you were talking about business card, Ramesh. There is something about address. Okay. All right. So you tell me, do you have anything, any story that you would?
I particularly like a story of Janet and her sister.
Okay.
Built on sibling rivalry, and which is something which is most of us have gone through, but also set in very neatly, I would say, juxtaposed with marital violence. So read something out of there.
Okay. And also history, right? Because I wanted to show how domestic violence is so close to the world wars.
True.
Okay, now let me see where I can read from. Yeah, so this is definitely the sibling dynamics between two growing up sisters, and so many things. I'll read a funny episode, actually, not one of the more serious ones. Okay. So the month of May, the season of holidays and mangoes, slipped upon us, as I sat to relish the smell of orange mangoes Alfonso's, also devouring in the aroma of freshly bound notebooks brought from the local supplier for the new academic year. I always managed to get a new history textbook, even if I borrowed the rest from older friends who graciously handed them down. Ma, in turn, kept my textbooks for Janet, hoping each year that the syllabus wouldn't change. There had been quiet for some days. I was flipping through my new books, reading a random page from history, when a thought occurred to me. What if my parents were born in the times of great struggle and war? Would they have used their brute force for something like, say, the mutiny or the 42's Quit India movement? Would they, with the spite that raged inside them, have risen against the Nazis? Why do you think both are wrong? First it was him, then her, now you say both are. I think you are against Ma because she makes you do more housework, and against Pa because he doesn't give you pocket money, said Janet. You are so dumb to think so. You are. You. Janet and I did not speak again for days, exchanging only nods or grunts for essential decisions, like the color of a newly shared bathing soap, or regulating the fan for the night, or the appropriate time for turning off the night lamp. Ma did sense something amiss. It was those days that Janet and I were not only joined by a polarity of opinions, but also by boys. She fancied Michael, a guy we ran into frequently at church. He had been my dance partner for one of the events. I can bet he hasn't even looked at you, I said. and you think he likes you. I never said that. You think only you are beautiful, and you think you are. We sprang to the mirror, darting eyes over the confluence of our cheeks, the bridges of our noses, the continent of our chin, eyebrows, eyelashes, forehead. I look better. No, it's me. So then let Michael decide. I finally said, fine. We gave our challenge a week's time. Now, Michael was a school dropout who worked with cycles in a hire and repair shop. He did not have the stress of math tests and chemistry equations over his face, and this added to his enchantment. Frisky blonde hair, fair skinned with a dimple on an angular face. He did not have a trace of his boiled face, black haired parents in him. When you don't oil your hair, it becomes like that, like hay, Ma told us. Janet took the morning and noon slots on her way to and from school, and I the evenings on the way back from tuitions. It was only talk in those days. No one could have expected more. I don't know what Janet did, but I invented topics and spoke of as many things as possible. Empty laughs would follow as we shared the setting of many an evening sun over the rows of trees and four-storied buildings of our town. It went on like this for 7 grueling days. And as it turned out, Michael chose me. Janet had to accept defeat and that I was more beautiful. From then on, she was more agreeable. But I had to keep distance from the spoils of my victory. There was only one idea haunting Michael after that, an eventual marriage. And I wasn't much into cycles. There was never another instance when we fancied the same guy, but we had come to agree that we were different. And then it goes on and on with the parents fighting and history and sisters.
I want to ask you something which has bugged me for some time, and that is the short story. You know, as a genre itself, it has gotten rather short shrift. Publishers don't like them. They hardly have any kind of circulation, unlike, say, Pulp Fiction. They don't even have snobbery value like poetry. So you rarely get invited to lit clubs for short fiction as compared to poetry or writing a long novel, short fiction in schools also, what I remember, and if I look at modern textbooks, I don't think they'll differ, but we all had the old masters like O. Henry, Saki, Maupassant, etc. If you have an anthology of short stories, you really struggle going from publisher to publisher. So congratulations, you got a publisher and you got published in paper. It's the thing I must say nowadays. The last Nobel for a short story was to Alice Munro in 2013, but that also has been, few and far between. So what's happened to the short story? I know the last home of the short story is WhatsApp, but there most short stories pretend to be the real truths.
So what has happened to it? See, they keep predicting extinction, right? But then they predicted extinction they predicted for the short story. They once predicted it for poetry, for the novel, for books, printed books, and for humanity. Even humanity was supposed to be extinct. Okay, so I think there is a limited readership and target audience for short stories. We definitely enjoy them. Not everyone enjoys short stories, but there is a dedicated international readership, so which includes India, of course. Both practitioners who write short stories, who engage in it, who critique it, who publish and also read it. But yes, I think it has to do with the vessels of transcendence, because a novel allows you to really get lost and escape in its magnanimous size. And you can hang out much more in it. You meet the characters often. You can spend time in that story world. And a short story is quick. But then I feel you have short time, you have the short story. And you can, if you want an immersive experience, because I think the more you hang out in a particular story world, you form more bonds with the characters and you escape, you live through them. It's between the catharsis and the metamorphosis of a reader. And that's the reason we go for longer works. But then having said that, when you are just a bit thirsty, it is the short form like a poem a haibun or a short story that works. So I feel it's about thirst, you know.
Excellent. Coming to that, what's a good length for a short story? You know, when I write short stories, I can barely persuade myself to write beyond 1500 words. I like to keep it extremely minimal, as few descriptions as possible, rich in dialogue. You know, I want my reader to fill in. I want the reader to decide what the color of the shirt is, what fragrance he puts on his body, and all of that. So I do not like detail.
Right.
You are, on the other hand, rich in detail in many of your short stories. The one about Lucy and his perfume is seriously, I mean, I don't know how much research you put into that.
Did you get drowned in that?
I am still living up to this mess. You know, the way you went into the minutest details, there had roots had to be treated in a certain way, and flowers in a certain way, and bark in a certain way, and all of that. So a lot of rich detail, which also gives you a picture into, but ultimately all that went into constructing Lucy for us.
Right.
Because we had to live in his head of smells.
Right.
So again, where do you think is a good length for a short story?
That's a very interesting question, and you know, it's such a long and wide and deep question, because in case of Rusi and him being a perfumer, because the story doesn't move very fast, okay, it moves in its contemplative, meditative slowness, and because we're living in the head of this perfumer, I thought his details are necessary because we have to have the fidelity of the obsession that he has. And you can't have that by just saying few things about him. You have to go into his obsession and be obsessive. So I think for me, details is only as much as the story demands. If the story needs atmosphere, I'll give it the details of atmosphere. If it needs characterization details, I'll give it to that point. Or till the point I find it amusing as a creator, but I try not to see. My one eye is always placed on the plot, that the plot doesn't get derailed, because sometimes it could be that, you know, you come across such enriching details that you can get lost, you know, and then the plot gets derailed. So I just see to it that I'm giving that much detail to build atmosphere, to build the characters, to be faithful to what they're going through, but not more than that. Not more than that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
One more question. What do you think is the purpose of a short story? Again, when I read, it's more plot driven. There has to be a twist. There has to be all of those. What you described, Haibun liberates you from. Right? But I need mine to be heavily plot driven. Many of yours are not that terribly plot driven, as much as I see they are character driven. They're snippets into a character more than that of the plot itself. Like Wilson's mother, the most pathetically etched characters I've ever come across. So, you know, do you say it's a glimpse into a life of a human, like a Bildungsroman? Or is it like an escapology? You know, the short stories of Sherlock Holmes are always for me to escape into that fantastic world of late Victorian London and all the chases and the things that he did. Or, you know, or like stories of Baudelaire or Aesop, where it is all about this great moral purpose. So what do you see your short stories doing for the reader?
Yeah. See, when you say Sherlock's and all, they are come in the genre fiction of being detective fiction and magic realism. But when I'm writing, especially this book, it was on social realism, or it was on realism. Apart from the fact that the word count is very short, you know, you could try 3,000 words. I have even gone to short stories that are 12,000 words, not for this book, but 12,000 words, and one that went to 17,000 words because it needed that amount of canvas because the idea was large, but it almost seemed like it's heading towards the novella, which is 20,000 words. This is not in that book, of course, but here this book was on social realism. So there is only a certain, you know, canvas that you have, a size, 3,000 words or 5,000 words, you know, and in that canvas, you can't have it too pacey. If it's too pacey, it will become dense, like a synopsis of a novel. So a short story also has to have its space to breathe. So usually it is one or two events that shape a life of a person. So if the Haibun was a narrative of an epiphany, this is a narrative of one event, a short story, or two events, that happen between beginning, middle, and end, with two or three characters. You can't have too many characters also, because that again becomes like a web series. So given all that, this is what fits in that frame. So the pace is very important in the short story. You can't hasten it a lot, because you have such limited time for the writer to connect with the character, and so for the reader to connect with the character, and that connection has to be made. If you don't make that connection, you are not going to find Kay D'Souza pathetic in Noise. You find her pathetic because I've given her that time to be herself, to imbibe the noise of the city, to feel the loneliness of her lost son and the other son. You need that time, and it's very difficult to do that in a short story. So I feel, for me, personally, it's not like Sherlock's, not detective, not magic realism. I think we do a lot of magic realism in poetry, in Haibun, even in magic realism itself, speculative stories. I wrote a speculative story which came in this Open Your Eyes anthology called Saturnalia. So that was speculative. It was about a bee, and the bee talks, right? So it was very speculative. But here I think it is to explore human irrationality, or life's irrationality that happens to human beings. Either ways. So it's the purpose of writing short stories is to explore this.
So we are running down the clock. So I'm going to ask you my last question, and then I'm going to ask you to read your favorite page from the book. The last question is here. Whenever I've had friends over in Bombay, and then they go back, I think a hangover is precisely how they describe their experience of the city. That it so fills their senses that whether they go back to Chennai or Kolkata or Delhi, they still take a day or two to shake Bombay up. Well, it sounds, it's tastes, we do everything in its extremes. There is no gentility to us, there's no moderation. And the pictures of Bombay that you see, it also, so I guess the title is singularly apt. But the cover image that it shows,
Yeah, I must show that
cover. You didn't choose, say, some of the more, like I put the sea link on the picture because it's the story of the shiny new bauble that we have. And, almost like fist shaken defiantly at the clouds. Or then you have pictures of the gateway of India, or the pigeons flying over the, the Taj Mahal Hotel.
Right.
Or otherwise you have pictures of Dharavi, or pictures of Dhobi Ghat. There's very specific pictures. But you chose which is spectacularly mundane a picture with a bunch of contradictions.
Yes. Pedestrian is the word. And it's a mindful pedestrian, because it's just rickshaws, and there's a little glimpse of a BST bus. Because when I was thinking about what Bombay meant for me, I never thought about what Bombay meant for me, because I was always looking at Bombay, admiring its people, looking at its hustle, bustle, being angry, being happy, everything. When I asked myself, hey, what's the cover? And the cover was not Haji Ali, and it was not Dhobi Ghat, and it was not the Grand Taj Hotel, and it was not the ceiling. So you have it with you, Ramesh. So I was wondering, what is Bombay for me? Plus, what are these characters in this story? What is Bombay for them? And I realized it is the accessible rickshaw that you just hail. It is a very approachable Bombay. It's a very earthy Bombay. It's a very rickshaw kind Bombay. So that was it. And it's very pedestrian, but I think where this really strikes is in two places, Ramesh. It's so pedestrian that, you're like, Bombay. When it was the lockdown, and this book came to me in this year of February 2021, because my publisher decided that it's time, we can't wait for the lockdown to end. Let's go ahead and publish your book. We waited an entire year, and I didn't hurry him because, come on, it's lockdown. And he sent the book, and by then I had truly missed the roads and the din of the city. When this cover came to me, It was a remembrance of a noisy city. Okay, in this standstill silence of the lockdown. This was one thing. And when this book reached certain of my international friends, they were like, oh, the tuk-tuk, oh, Bombay, like, oh, the rickshaws. They were so happy with this, So this is the Bombay for this one. But I must say one more thing. I let the characters, tell me what they think about cities. So I'm writing a novel, and in that, the character remembers Bombay through the Gulmohar tree. So,
Wow.
yeah.
We have plenty of that where I stay, and I have to keep an eye out for falling branches.
but not to miss the beauty of that Gulmohar tree. So,
Right.
yeah.
So thank you. That's all I had to ask. But I'm going to ask you to read your favorite page.
Wow. Okay. I hope we're not running out of time. But I don't know. Should we open it up for Q&A? Because I think I have read twice, so should be enough.
No, we have enough time. You can
We
go
have
ahead
time?
and yes.
Sure. Okay.
Yes, we
so-
do, Rochelle. Do read another page also.
Sure.
And then we'll open it
All
up
right.
for questions.
All right. Okay, so I'll read, Ramesh, I'll read Noise, because we were talking about K. D'Souza. So, okay. Mahim. Years earlier, the city had gotten into him. Every morning, Jonathan D'Souza wore a blue shirt, grey tie, black trousers, and ate the same kind of egg. His mother, Kay, put forth a sunny side up to him. He liked breaking the yolk, seeing its stickiness spill out. The noise from the roads below swelled with rush hour honking. Its screeching and beeping induced a liminal sonic pentameter in him. There was a rhythm in his steps as John walked to work. It would take 30 minutes from Mahim to Bandra if the footpaths and promenades were clear. But beggars and hawkers crowded the footpaths. The promenades were partly filled with second-hand cars ready for sale, and the traffic was unmoving at best to the slow choreography of tricolored signals. This made for an hours-long walk to Hill Road. Today was the same march like always. John felt the morning's heat over his skin. He could tell the time by the amount of sweat sprouting from his back, the way his vest and shirt were wet. He glanced at his watch. Same time, every morning, 9:20 a.m. Only today he looked at the road leading to Bandra train station. He stopped and stared at the forked road for a while, then slid off the sling of his bag, keeping it by the side of a lamppost. He rolled up his cuffs, loosened his tie, and walked over to Bandra station, boarding the first train that came to his platform. The train was heading in the opposite direction of the business centers, but was just as crowded. At Andheri, harried travellers pushed him out. He fell to the concrete on all fours, and passers-by hurriedly helped him to his feet. From there he went across the overhead bridge and boarded an outstation train. In this long blue train were a few empty berths. The train began to pick up speed, and it rocked him into a trance. Before he knew it, John slid over the lowest berth and went to sleep. It was a deep sleep. When he woke, he went to the door and stood staring at the landscape. Tall buildings had changed to short buildings, and houses, and then just trees. It had been 14 hours. The land was flat now, and green and brown. No tree, no thought, just the amusement of being alive. John went back to his berth and slept for all the times in his life he had missed sleeping because of Wilson. It was 7:30, and it had grown dark. Kay sat on her chair on the balcony, watching the liberty blue of twilight dim into indigo. The lights outside every balcony burst into orange flames, flowers with star lanterns and fairy lights. Diwali was around the corner, and the air rife with smoke clouds from firecrackers. She put a handkerchief over her nose. For a change, the mosquitoes had stopped buzzing. It was late for John today, thought Kay. Usually, he was home by 6:30. Maybe the crackers bursting on the roads had slowed him down. Wilson watched TV, bouncing over his corner of the sofa. The spring on that side had given way, its cloth torn, foam spilling out of the rip like a smile. Wilson was 37, but 4 in his head. On most days, he would fall asleep at 5 p.m. and wake at 4 a.m. and yell or squeal for breakfast. He liked 3 things: lapsi, that is wheat porridge, banana fritters, and rice kiki, calling them lop lop, frita, and kiki. Kay had to understand that and make a dash into the kitchen. When he woke, he would rush to the toilet. She had taught him to untie and tie his pant strings. He would be back at the dining table banging his steel spoon on the plate. She had to have his food prepared in 10 minutes. She kept most of the batter ready in the fridge the previous night, and even a washed pan with a ladle in it on the stove. The noises Wilson made did not disturb the neighbors of the building, but it would wake John up in the quiet hour, even if he used cardboard and thermocol bits as wedges in the gaps of his closed door. Kay felt sad about this, but she was never going to send Wilson to a care home. Giving him even half a sleeping pill gave him reactions. Once he didn't wake until noon, once he didn't sleep until noon, and once he didn't speak the whole day. His head and mind were too soft, she concluded. It was 10 p.m. now, and no sign of John. He would have otherwise at least called. Kay dug into the cabinet in the drawing room for the phone book and found his office number. The watchman answered. "Sir, all have left for home." "Do you know if John Baba, Jonathan D'Souza, is still working, or has he left?" "No, sir, he's not here." Kay would have corrected the watchman that she was a lady, but her worried voice may have sounded like a man's. Yeah, I'll stop here.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Ma'am.
Yes, maybe there are questions from the audience, comments, questions, whatever. Would everyone like to unmute themselves? Let's make it a little informal and not put the questions in the chat box.
Yeah, I'm quite curious. Where did John go?
John went. He just went and he never returned. But the hope stayed. Yeah. Okay. And so the stories about hope and noise and the fact that he will return.
Right.
I'm sure there are many more people who wish to, now that the ice is broken, yes, why doesn't everybody put their videos on and unmute themselves? And so let's have a small discussion here.
Yes, I mean to say, I'm ready for any question, anything, any comments.
I have a couple of things to say, but I'm going to wait till the end because I have read the stories and appreciated them. So maybe there are others who wish to ask.
May I ask a question, Mangala here? May I ask a question?
Yeah, please go ahead, Mangala, please.
Yeah, I want to know how long you took to write these stories, and the stories referred, I mean, such a wide variety. How did you manage to get such a wide variety? Was it all, we talked about experience, imagination, empathy at the beginning. How much of a dose of empathy, imagination, and real experience went into these stories?
Mangala, this is a very, very, beautiful question, and it's such a large question. So I thank you for it. So when I collated this book, I realized I hadn't written this as a book project. Okay, it was not a planned book project. I began the first story in 2007, The Metamorphosis of Joe Pereira, which figures in here, and the last story was written somewhere in 2015. And only when, you have this fear that your desktop is going to crash actually. And that's the time you think I should compile it and send it away as a book. So I had reached that point and I was looking at what stories I had. I had stories in the realism genre and speculative fiction. So when I looked at these stories, I was trying to find a common theme, and I was surprised that so many stories had Bombay, the city, in them. So I realized that the city has seeped so much into me, and I didn't know that. So I collated this book. Because this was not a conscious book project, so it followed an organic route of whatever ideas came at one point in time.
Right.
So it's so randomly collated, but finally the only saving grace is that they all are Bombay stories. So they could get themselves into this book. And that's how it went. And so talking about the other part of your question, I think, lived experiences are there. Slice is a bit of lived experience. The sisters and some bit of domestic violence. It's quite extrapolated here. History, because whenever my parents would squibble, I would always think, there's a, there is a World War III going to happen shortly. But then that always happens when you don't know what's really war. You come to the city and then you see, oh my God, this is the real war. So even the perspective of war keeps changing. We are so limited by our, and so obsessed by our personal space and thinking that this is everything. And then you open up those orbits and there's a lot more of stuff going on. And then you have a proportion to your experiences. So some of it are my relatives, like, Joe Pereira is Rosie Nazareth. So I have changed gender sometimes. I have worked with colleagues, so lived with them. So there's a lot of lived experiences in the sense of sharing lives with people. And some of them are just observing. Some of them is empathy while you're researching. You want to know about that watchman who's just guarding you, but you think he's not just, just guarding your building. He probably had such large dreams. And who was he, or really? Who was this maid really?
Right.
And all those querying. But yeah, then it all came.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very nice.
Surely there are others who want to say something.
Is it a story collection, madam? Is it story collection?
Yes, it is.
Arvind Sonawale.
Yes,
is it story collection?
Yes,
Can we say?
Yeah, it's a collection of short stories called Bombay Hangovers.
Stories,
yes, called Bombay Hangovers.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. If Ramesh can post that link, if you wouldn't mind, Ramesh, posting that link of the story.
Yeah, I'll find it and post it.
Yes, we put it in the notice that was sent out to our members. But I think it would be very useful to post the link, because I really, would like to encourage everyone to read these stories. They are just totally original and beautifully written, honestly. I'm not saying this to flatter you at all, but so are there any more questions from the literary types here?
Yeah, hi, can you hear me?
Yes, Bindu.
Yes, who's that?
This is Bindu. I'm a friend of Ramesh and Rochelle. Hi.
Hi, Bindu.
So I've got a published novel, which oddly enough has been published around the same time as yours. And it is a collection of 13 short stories. So we seem to be somewhere, and it's about Bombay.
Oh, that's lovely. That's lovely. What is it titled?
It's called Of Beasts and Beauty.
Oh, my.
Wonderful, wonderful.
Yes.
And from what I've heard of your reading, your stories are very direct, and I'm sure Ramesh would bear this out. They deal very much with the ordinary, everyday Mumbaikar, and, sort of tracing their lives. So it's really interesting. I just thought I'd share with you. My stories are on a totally different trajectory, but I had intended titling it Low Life in High Rise at one stage.
That's wonderful. That's a beautiful title, alternative title too.
Correct.
Yes. I'll definitely check it out.
Lovely, good talking with you and hearing your wonderful literary journey. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bindu.
Thank you, Ramesh. Thank you, the
Bindu, maybe you could put the title of your book in the chat box.
I will.
So that, you know, others may, who may
Certainly.
wish to read it.
Certainly.
That would be nice. That would be nice.
So
Thank you.
Yeah, bye.
In fact, when you talk about the ordinary Mumbaikar, I love the way you explain the cover of the book. I hadn't looked at it that way. And it really has so much meaning because I think most people in Mumbai do depend on the auto rickshaw.
Yes.
For one reason or the other. And so I was just thinking of it as a traffic jam, but in fact, it is just auto rickshaws, you know, and there's a lot that could be said about the cover, really. It's a highly significant, symbolic kind of cover.
Thank you. And I think I myself missed it in the lockdown. This din, you know. Yeah.
Okay.
I'll ask just one more question if nobody is asking. May I?
Yes, please.
No, go ahead, because there will be others, I'm sure.
I would like, if there are others, then let them finish and I'll
No, I don't think right now there are, but there might be.
Yeah, no, I was saying that, didn't you think of, as a woman, I mean, maybe it's a wrong question, but as a woman thinking of women's experience of the city, I was thinking of some Marathi writers who have written of women and train travel, women and what they go through, you know, the city's experience for the middle class woman.
Right.
Yeah.
So
are there any among your stories women centered or focused?
Yes, there are all the stories have women who have a very woman's kind of, you know, space. And because they're in the city, yes, like if you look at one story which comes to my mind very quickly is Fabric. And when we are talking about the psychology of the mill worker who doesn't become a mill worker, but rather, you know, a security guard at a mall, while we are tracing his journey, we are looking at his wives. He had two wives. And when they come together after his death, we look at the devastation from the women's point of views.
Very interesting. Yeah.
So what happens to women? So there's a lot of feminist space because I believe that we need to tip the narrative balance by also giving women a large space for narrating their experiences. So from the first story, Arithmetic of Breast with Monica and the breast cancer, to everything, there are all ages of women also, you know, like rape survivors and young girls, but there is.
Yes, and the mathematical, you know, the story with the mathematical, what is it called? The arithmetic of breast.
Yes.
I mean, that's very interesting too. Maybe you'd like to speak a little about that woman there.
Yes, and that woman is, for a while you're reading it, you might think that has the least amount of space. But her space comes from the interpretation of anatomy, because I'm looking from the male's gaze. I wanted to do this as a woman, to really use a male gaze to watch female anatomy and set it right. So it's like a double-edged sword that I've tried here. But she does see most of, whether it is not to do about short stories or not, I believe in life that if it's women or marginalized people or whomever, they need to take agency eventually. They need to take life in their hands. So sometimes the characters more or less also go in that direction. They take back their space, they reclaim their narratives. Yeah, they hoist their...
That's right. Like in the story about the Fabric, I thought the structure was very interesting, because in the first part, you only do the narration from the outside. You don't go into the psychology of this man, Kailas.
Yes.
You know, you just tell us about his story. And then the second part is these women bonding, you know, and you don't even realize that he has led this kind of double life.
Yes.
And you know, and the way he takes his anger and frustration out on these women, that is so revealing, because his journey has been such a terrible one, you know, having to forget about all his ambitions and his dreams and, you know, and then you wonder what's going on inside his head in the first part, and then you realize that no, it was not at all smooth sailing for him. he didn't just accept the reality, but he rebelled against it in this terrible fashion. And as always, you take it out on the women around you.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. And that is I think where we don't we have to go closer to see, because sometimes it's on children. The adults always unleash their trauma on children, on the more vulnerable kinds.
Yes.
So to understand it from both sides, basically, I wanted to do that, to understand the vulnerabilities from both ends, and the women, because they have always been mute for so long.
Interesting. You give visibility and also a voice to women. That's very good. Yeah.
But at the same time, you don't delve into their psyche. You only see things from the outside. Their actions, their conversations. Am I right?
Yeah. That is because I didn't have more space for the short stories. So because there's such limited space, and fabric is already I think it's 5,500 words. So it was going to threaten to become like a very long story. Yeah. So, but in my novels, which I'm writing, there's a lot of space given to explore, because you have so much more space to to contemplate.
So I think we should also read your novels.
It's not yet out. It's going to be next year, perhaps.
Great, that's wonderful. And the story about the perfumes, maybe you'd like to tell everyone a little more about that, because I found that totally fascinating. How it all revolves around smells, perfumes, and where they come from. Would you like to?
So thanks for asking about that story, because as Ramesh said, there's so much of details in it. I don't know when I thought about the story, but I think it is all the times I went to the art district, or that the city, the downtown Kala Ghoda and the areas around it, and Parsis. I just love different communities, because I feel that there's so much of charm and madness. I come from a Goan Catholic community. I like all those quirks that are there in communities. So I don't know when Rusi infiltrated into me, and when I thought about this fixation of perfume. But once it took hold, I think it had to do with all the dirty smells in the city. Okay, that from fish to salt to gutter to I don't know what. When you come across, you're like, where are those good smells? And somewhere where are those good smells? Especially when you're on the streets. And then you start thinking about, what if that guy has only the good smells, and he's sitting in his room and he's intoxicated with perfume, and he wants to make a PhD finding that perfume, that quintessential perfume. And what would happen if that one olfactory sense is the be all and end all? He's following his nose. And then as you ask, what if, because basically one of the ways of, exploring is what if? And then I followed Rusi, and I really followed the guy, and I really researched a lot on perfume in itself, from base note to top note. What are the flowers required? What vials are used? How are they refrigerated? I think I had fun researching. After a while, I don't know, I became a perfumer. But yes, I think I had to hack some details also. Ramesh, this is good news for you. I hacked some details.
Very
Can you explain that? What you mean?
Like, I mean to say, if you read, there would be a lot of details of how he makes the perfumes, the top note, the base note, the flowers he uses, the flowers he imports from internationally. And while he's doing that, we're also tracking his marriage to Marinette.
That's right.
Yeah. So
and how the two go hand in hand.
Yes. So we're tracking the perfume of a marriage and the perfume of this obsession. And then I was like, enough.
Lovely way of putting it.
Yeah.
Lovely way of putting it. Yes.
Talking of Pushpa had a question. Some people have an interesting life and we're tempted to write about them. But if they found out, they'd get severely offended.
So Pushpa, I don't know what Ramesh would suggest or what the others would suggest, but you just change their names. Yeah, I do that all the time. Like if you look at my poem Gathering, which is in 4 Degrees of Separation, or you will find it on the net as well. It's just the change of names. The details are all the same. And my family doesn't love poetry, so they don't know.
Oh, I do a lot of that too. I mean,
Yeah.
when you're writing a story, obviously, when you read it up, somebody's been a character in your. I write a lot about my aunts, and I have to make sure that I mask a lot of names, some of the circumstances, so that if it ever falls into the hands of an aunt, I'm in hot water.
No, I just conveniently changed the name. So most of the things what I love is the same. Their characterization, their quirks. How can we miss that, no?
I know. So you've really introduced us into such a wide range of characters here. People that we've not met and never imagined would exist. And, that is really, the whole point of getting into reading and certainly short stories. Yeah, lovely. Yes. Are there any more questions, or shall we wrap up the session? Anyone else want to say anything? Your friend Pushpa, she's not unmuted herself, Ramesh.
Yeah, sent me her question. I guess she's not able to unmute herself now. Pushpa, you have any questions? You were going to ask some questions, no, ma'am.
Who? Me?
Yes, ma'am.
No. So I talked about those two stories, which really, struck me. And yeah, and also I just, so let me just say that it's been really fascinating this evening. It's also been very energizing. And I think that is very important. And also the fact that, the two of you together, and certainly the writer, Rochelle, has, allowed us to have a peek into so many different spaces in the city. And I don't just mean, geographical spaces, but also, mental and psychological and literary and all the rest. So it's been really very interesting. And I just want to thank both of you and wish you all the best. I'm sure you have a very successful journey ahead of you. And I do hope you will continue to participate in all the activities of our society, because we mainly think about the Asiatic these days. And so we hope that people like you will remain with us and join us for all our activities. And so thank you very much. And I want to end by giving our thanks to Usha, who's the lead, a single woman in the technical team, that she's there for us. So thank you again, Usha.
My pleasure.
Okay, so shall we
yes, I would also like to thank all of you for your questions, your engagement. It was thoroughly enjoyable. And thank you, Ramesh, for getting us all together, and I'm going to be participating more with Asiatic Society of Mumbai. Thank you, Meenal ma'am. Thank you, Dr. Usha. Thank you, Vispi ma'am. Thank you, everybody, for this engagement.
Yes, and thank you, Ramesh. It was his idea, and I'm really happy that he suggested it to us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Have a good evening. Bye. Bye.